Russia's invasion of its neighbor has changed the world. The horror in Ukraine could drag on for weeks, months, or years to come. Putin could fall tomorrow, or he could also hold on to significant parts of Ukraine and consolidate power in a more authoritarian Russia. But no matter what happens in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has failed. He hasn't just failed miserably to defend his western borders, he has also done something tremendously damaging to Russia and anybody else who was excited about a post-American world. He has given the United States a gift, and he has given the United States a weapon that can be used against not just Russia, but China as well. Russia has made the United States look like the good guys again. Now, for most news consumers in the United States, the idea that we were ever anything other than the good guys may be surprising. US media keeps most Americans from understanding the true value of the gift that Russia just gave us. From Syria to Libya to Ukraine, Afghanistan, and even Iraq, US news tells us that, well, mistakes were made, but everybody knows our intentions were good, right? As I've tried to convey on my YouTube channel for most of a decade now, no, the rest of the world does not think that we are the good guys. This fundamental misunderstanding in US media and government makes it possible that we're going to miss a once-in-a-century opportunity for the second time in 20 years. Today I'll describe the past 2 decades as the rest of the world sees it, and what we should be doing right now to cement our reputation as the good guys and use it against China before Washington, D.C. comes up with some other nonsense that blows up our reputation all over again. The United States has tremendous economic and cultural power. At the dawn of this century, the 1-2 punch of the world surviving the Cold War and the US suffering the 9/11 attack added nearly infinite political power as well. Our economic and political system had demonstrated its superiority to communism after a half-century of struggle. The savage attack on New York and Washington, D.C. by some of the Cold War's dumbest remnants added a martyr's gleam to the penumbra of victory that already surrounded the United States. In the fall of 2001, the world was ready to do almost anything the United States asked. We were only limited by our imagination in early 2002, and a new world order of peace and prosperity wasn't just possible, it was almost likely. Unfortunately,
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred.
with his Axis of Evil speech in February 2002, George W. Bush demonstrated that neither he nor the people in his administration had any imagination at all. Rather than lead the world forward, Bush and his people tried to lead the world back into a sad, farcical retread of the Cold War. In the pursuit of this goal, we absurdly pumped up the insignificant countries we were picking fights with. Singling out Iran was particularly tragic. In the fall of 2001, they had rallied to the US's cause, helping us win a quick military and political victory in Afghanistan. The United States has not had a single foreign policy victory in the 20 years since Bush's criminally stupid speech. North Korea became a nuclear power on Bush's watch, and he turned Iran from a possible friend into a regional power and an implacable enemy. Bush did manage to take out Iraq, but he did so at such an obscene cost in lives across the Middle East that he fundamentally discredited U.S. leadership for the 18 years that followed. U.S. media will tell you that all sins were washed away by the election of Barack Obama, but that couldn't be further from the truth. We have a very, very rough, but I think effective measure of what the rest of the world thinks of the United States under all the layers of US government and media bullshit. We have Germany. In 2002, Germany and France joined with Russia to condemn Bush's planned invasion of Iraq as an absurd atrocity. They were completely right, of course. Bush's invasion of Iraq was loathed by the world as well as the majority of the publics of all of our allies, and it shattered the US's relationship with our biggest and richest European ally from March of 2003 until February of 2022. Obama's election was welcomed, not just in the United States, as an opportunity for change. Surely this young, charismatic person of color would abandon Bush's war on terror with its extrajudicial detention in Guantanamo, drone assassinations everywhere, and ever-expanding set of undeclared wars. Nope. Obama barely provided a rebrand. His main effect was to neuter the Democratic Party's previously powerful anti-war movement. In 2011, French and British defense industry greed prompted the elites of those countries to join the United States in destroying Libya, plummeting all of North Africa into a lost economic decade. I've referred to this as the NATO destruction of Libya in the past, but I was wrong about that. I forgot that Germany, again, wisely, stayed the hell out of it. Angela Merkel didn't just refuse German participation in NATO's invasion of Libya, she even abstained from the UN Security Council resolution that authorized it. Whether you think she could see the disaster coming or was just making a political decision based on widespread US unpopularity in Germany, it serves my point. Even under heartthrob Obama, nobody outside of North America thought the US was on the side of the angels anymore. In recent weeks, people have pilloried Merkel and Obama for not doing more about Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, and people may be right to do that. But they're forgetting that back in 2014, the United States was doing something very similar to what Russia did to Ukraine, but worse. Putin was smarter in 2014. He used special forces skullduggery and Ukrainian forces with legitimate grievances to carve up his target back then. These were, of course, the identical tools that the United States was using to carve up Syria at the same time. Washington, D.C. think tanks certainly don't see it that way, but most outside the United States who cared to investigate the question could see U.S. imperialism in Syria for what it was. And the U.S.-backed separatists started a conflict in Syria that killed hundreds of thousands, and almost killed the European Union with its refugee flows. Russia's imperialism in Ukraine only killed 10,000 or so people prior to February 2022. As Europe and the world began to emerge from the refugee Brexit storm Obama had given them, the United States elected Donald Trump. His administration provided the worst of both worlds. His hirelings and his Congress were brutally anti-Russia, while Trump himself constantly kissed Putin's ass. Put simply, it was confusing. The US's arming of Ukraine under Trump made Russia reckless, while Trump's personality and statements made it impossible for anybody to respect or follow the United States in anything. US backing for Saudi and UAE imperialism in Yemen also confused the issue. Putin's subversion and annexation of parts of Ukraine in 2014 horrifically expanded the realm of the possible. Both our enemies and our allies got excited about stealing territory. In 2015, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates invaded Yemen after a party they didn't like won a civil war there. The Gulf monarchies' squabbles with each other made their invasion a complete failure, but their ongoing competitive attempts to de facto annex islands, deserts, and port cities in Yemen have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. With the encouragement of the Russian and Saudi examples, Turkey stepped up its US-supported destruction of Syria with outright occupation of territory, starting in 2016 and expanding from there. Crucially, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are staunch US allies. There are people in the United States that complain about these occupations, like me, but they are carried out with weapons and often intelligence and other support provided by the US. We work hard in the United States to crush voices that make these parallels, but for everyone outside of our media market, it was easy, before February, to see Russia's crimes as just smaller, less destructive versions of things that the United States had done and was continuing to do. Germany's opposition to every U.S. foreign intervention since 2003 was one indicator of how far the U.S. had fallen in the world's estimation. But so was the widespread discrediting of democracy. The whole spreading axis of autocracy idea was always mostly Pentagon marketing, but there is a kernel of truth there. Despite all our financial and media power, between 2003 and 2022, if the U.S. was selling a political concept, the world just wasn't as interested anymore. All our preaching about democracy and human rights became so toxic because of what it had produced in the Middle East that people understandably became more interested in stability than freedom. In Syria specifically, and more broadly, dictatorship began to look more attractive than anything the US was offering. Did bad actors in China and Russia exploit this? Of course. But the successes and sheer political duration of figures like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were secondary effects of abysmal foreign policy choices that the US government made. For the past 20 years, we have been the biggest threat to the world and the biggest threat to ourselves. We were the bad guys. Until February 24th. By invading Ukraine, Russia has shown that there are worse things in the world than the United States. I am the first to acknowledge that there is some racism in the fact that the world seems to care a lot more about Ukrainians than it does about Syrians, Iraqis, or Yemenis. But it's important to recognize that Putin's poor man's George W. Bush routine is a lot more destructive than anything my country has done this century. The United States was always too smart to get into a fair fight. We haven't operated anywhere without air superiority since the 1940s. Ukraine is far outmatched, but what we are seeing in that poor country is very close to a conventional war between near-peer military forces. This is the first time we've seen something like this since the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. This is a hellishly costly form of conflict. Russia is widely believed to have lost more soldiers in 3 weeks than the United States lost in all 20 years of the War on Terror. That's certainly humiliating for Russia, but it also means that the toll in civilians and their opponents is also probably vastly higher as well. The shorthand I use for deaths in US-created conflicts may be a bit misleading here. I tend to include deaths from all causes, US bombs, but also civil wars, starvation, and diseases caused by sanctions as well, over the course of decades. The higher estimates of Iraqi civilians killed directly by the US military in the initial US conquest are around 7,000 to 10,000. I assume that many more Ukrainians have already been killed by Russia's war, or will be shortly, with no real prospect of this invasion phase of extreme slaughter stopping, or even slowing down. In fact, most expect civilian casualties to accelerate in the coming weeks. A truly horrific prospect. Quick note from the editing process. Let me try to make that point a little more clearly. The two periods of the worst war crimes that the United States has committed this century were probably in the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003. That's when we killed an estimated 7,000 to 10,000 civilians. The second worst would probably be when we retook Mosul, working with the Iraqi army, retook Mosul between 2016 and 2017 from the Islamic State, an entity that we inadvertently helped create. In that process, we have no exact numbers, but estimates seem to indicate that we killed 9,000 to 10,000 civilians. These are horrific crimes that the United States has committed. That was a 7-month battle in Mosul. That was taking an entire country back in 2003. I would estimate that if Russia hasn't already killed more people than we did in those two massive war crime events in Ukraine, if they haven't killed more civilians already, they certainly will by a month or two from now, and there's no indication that this fighting is going to slow down, or that the rate of civilians being massacred by Russia is going to do anything other than speed up. That's what I'm talking about. What Russia is doing is legitimately, or if not already, is potentially much worse than anything the United States has done this century. Russia has chosen to launch a war with consequences in human suffering that are far worse than anything the United States has participated in since the 1970s. And that's before we start talking about the effects on the rest of the world. Russia and Ukraine combined export 30% of the world's wheat, most of which goes through the now highly militarized Black Sea. It's unlikely that these wheat exports will be disrupted by sanctions, but it doesn't matter. Self-sanctioning and the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure have already driven prices through the roof. Oil and gas prices are also skyrocketing. Vladimir Putin's folly is almost guaranteed to push the world into a global recession. This is all truly horrible. But for the first time in 2 decades, the United States isn't the bad guy. Russia's the bad guy. And I'm not going to lie, as a US citizen, that feels pretty great. In an instant, Europe has decided to comply with 30 years of US requests to increase defense spending. And most importantly, Germany, that richest and most populous of European countries, has decided to start backing our plays all the way. 20 years of opting out and playing Russia and the US off of each other are over, and Germany is all in. However, and this is a big however, winning over Germany does not mean we have won over the rest of the world. Germany is a country that shares tons of cultural, religious, and sociological characteristics with the United States. Hell, more US white people have ancestors from Germany than anywhere else. The fact that a country as similar to us as Germany found US leadership so toxic over the past 20 years is an indicator of just how far we had fallen. But just because Germany and the rest of Europe are now on board with the United States, it doesn't mean that the rest of the world is too. Even before the oil and food crises start to hit, it's clear that the rest of the world doesn't yet buy that the United States are the good guys again. So we need to sell them on it, in a way we haven't really tried since the beginning of the Cold War. Russia has done us an enormous favor by doing something so evil and destructive. To make Russia look even worse, and to scare off anybody who might be considering supporting Russia, we need to clean up our own act. We've actually already started. Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan now looks like a stroke of genius. Can you imagine how silly we would look, complaining about Russia's invasion and occupation, if we still had a 20-year failed occupation going ourselves? Can you imagine how much danger our troops would have been in, as heavily US-supported Ukrainian troops slaughter Russian soldiers? The famous "Russia's giving the Taliban bounties to kill US soldiers" story from the 2020 election was a fraud, but in the current context, Russia would absolutely be doing exactly that. We're very lucky we're not there anymore. Getting out of Afghanistan was probably the hardest step. The rest of the things we should do are comparatively easy. The Biden administration is already taking steps forward with Venezuela and Iran in the hopes of getting more oil out to our own refineries and the rest of the world as well. This is great, but we need to do more, reaching out to governments like Cuba and the Houthis that have always governed 80% of the Yemeni people. We have real problems now. It's time to focus on the big issues, not hold grudges against geopolitical pygmies that do nothing but waste our time and money and build potential allies for Russia and China. Israel and Iran's tit-for-tat missile attacks in recent weeks remind us how much of a waste of time and focus the Middle East is for the United States. Far better to rein in our client states, sign the Iran nuclear deal, end our murderous sanctions, and get our troops the hell out of there. Middle East playtime is no longer necessary to keep defense budgets up. And every news story out of that region makes the US look like the bad guy, not Russia. China at the moment is terribly confused. It probably knew the Ukraine invasion was going to happen, but like the Obama administration that approved a 3-month Saudi invasion of Yemen that's still failing bloodily 7 years later, China had no idea what its client state was dragging it into. China has probably never been more susceptible to world opinion than it is today, and Russia has just taken a massive dump on its reputation that it did not need. China can be made to look like the bad guy in a really compelling way over Ukraine right now. But nobody outside of the United States is going to buy it if we keep on doing things in Yemen and Syria that can be portrayed as being very similar. In fact, the Yemen-Ukraine parallel, something I've been hammering on for years, just got a lot more relevant. If we want a quick end to the war in Ukraine, we need to get China to abandon its Russian satellite on this issue. There is no better way for the US to show the world it is serious about this than abandoning our own petro-client state's evil invasion. We could kill two birds with one stone by forcing Saudi Arabia to leave Yemen. We could clear off one of the greatest stains on our reputation and make China look worse if it refuses to do the same with its Russian client. I'm very confident that Washington, D.C. is now filled with people who are super eager to use our new good guy status to coerce small countries on every continent. That's exactly what we did the last two times our reputation soared, in 1989 and 2001. The results both times were pretty dismal. So why don't we try something different? Why don't we actually try to be the good guys this time and see if we get different results? There is no more powerful strategy to use against China in this moment. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment to let me know what you think. Thanks.